Have you ever wondered how marketers use brain science to get you to do what they want you to do? Today we're talking to Dr. Christophe Morin. He is one of the leading experts in neuromarketing, and he has a 6-step process on exactly what marketers and branders and companies are doing to your brain when they want you to buy things, when the ads they make, the content they create, and how to prevent your brain from getting hacked. All of this and more in today's episode of the Decision Lab.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Decision Lab. Today we are so thrilled to have Dr. Christophe Morin, a neuroscientist and author whose work focuses on neuromarketing and persuasion. So in other words, he knows the brain science of the companies. He knows the brain science companies use to hack your brain into doing what they want you to do and how to correct yourself. So let's dive in.
Heck yeah. I'm so pumped to have you here.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this one. Thank you so much for hopping on.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah, so it's for longtime listeners, they will probably remember Dr. Paul Zak. So he was like our first interview ever. Could you tell the audience a little bit about your relationship with Dr. Zak?
Yes, Dr. Zak, or Paul, has become both a mentor and a close friend. As I was moving into my dissertation, my doctorate in media psychology, I was really determined to apply good neuroscience to the investigation of consumer behavior. It took me a while to identify the kind of academic rigor that I wanted to run a test, and found him at his university in Claremont Graduate University, running this lab with the interesting name of Dr. Love. And so I know he was both somewhat eccentric, but also a very rigorous scientist. Managed to get an appointment with him, and of course we hit it off so quickly. I claim that I helped him become a neuromarketer, and he really helped me become a neuroscientist. So we had some sort of a deal, if you will, so that I would share all I knew, having initially been trained in consumer research with an MBA. I migrated all my interests into neuroscience, and he sort of did the opposite. And so we've stayed very close. I know he's been very busy. He just launched a book, so I'm really excited about that.
Heck yeah. I'm pumped. We help we help his company with like marketing and create content for them. And we got an early copy of the book, and we're going to help with some of the promo for it. So I'm very excited for that book too. And so cool that you guys interacted in that way. That's so cool.
Yeah, and we actually did several very large projects together, including, for instance, the first neuromarketing study for Facebook. I sold the deal, but at the time I had not yet made the investment of having my own equipment, the EEG, eye trackers, and so on. And so Paul was already set up to do that, and we collaborated on that together, which was really a wonderful experience, even though it was a bit stressful because, of course, Facebook was somewhat demanding, and more importantly, asked us initially to be secretive about it. I spent hours with their lawyers making sure that we were basically locked in never talking about it until they got the results and said, okay, you guys, this is way too big for us to not talk about it. Let's bring Paul and you into our studio. They recorded us talking about the findings of the study, and then eventually created their own lab.
What?
Yeah.
That's wild. I didn't even know that. What, like, my interest is piqued. What
Yes.
was the research? What was the study? Like, what'd you find that was so profound?
Well, we're talking, almost 10 years ago. And at the time, Facebook was still catching up to become a really strong platform, particularly advertising platform on mobile. And they were seeking to document and present credible scientific evidence that the behavior of people browsing on their platform and being, hit with an ad would be comparable, if not better, than watching these same ads on TV. So we set up an experiment, very simple, and the paper has been quite successful because they asked us to co-publish a paper with them. It was to set up two conditions of viewing ads, one in front of a large 32-inch It's not super large, but large enough to be called a TV. And then another experiment with mobile devices. We hooked people up with EEG and facial decoding and so on. And the conclusion surprised them. And I always remember the head of research at the time said, this is one of the most powerful study we've ever conducted, because the findings were really pointing to the remarkable effectiveness of smaller screens. Because in the way you look at media, and I'm a media psychologist, you tend to assume there is a direct correlation between the size of the experience, like movie theater, TV, and mobile, and would assume that by the time you come up to mobile, there's hardly any really impact, visual, cognitive, emotional, etc. And we didn't find that at all. In fact, it was quite the contrary. There were really fairly significant data points confirming that once we immerse ourselves into a story, a good narrative especially, we don't really need the size to connect emotionally and visually.
That is insane. That's so cool. Why? Why is that? Like what from your perspective in the brain makes that so?
It's because of this phenomena that both Paul and I are quite focused on, which is called narrative transportation. And I don't know if you've heard the term, but it really speaks to our ability, mostly unconscious ability, to immerse ourselves. He uses the word immersion a lot. As you know, it's the name of his company, where it used to be the name of one of his companies. I can't track him anymore. But this notion that in our brain, reality is what we see, is what we experience, is what we feel. And therefore, this notion of is it real, not real, is really not that real in terms of how it happens. So narrative transportation is explaining why we can actually watch a movie and start being afraid or start crying when we see a guy who's going to make $10 million actually, faking his death. And so none of that makes sense. And that's what neuroscience has taught me so much, is that, yes, we do have the capacity to be rational, to draw facts and make decisions. But for the most part, we're completely driven by this irrational nature, which is what I talk about in all my books, in a way, the responsibility of the primal structures, the primal brain.
Yeah, the primal brain. What is your perspective on mirror neurons? I found that most neuroscientists, I'm going to restart. What's your perspective on mirror neurons? I found that most neuroscientists are like split 50-50 on, yes, they exist. It's a cool metaphor, but not a mechanism. Like what's your thought?
I think the measured answer is that it's both. It's both. I mean, you have to understand that at the origin of the discovery of mirror neurons, you have a couple of neuroscientists in Italy. I'm French, so I'm kind of partial to the French view of things, even though I'm also American. But these couple of neuroscientists are studying, a couple of monkeys that are eating bananas. And they've hooked them up with EEGs. And unbeknownst to them, they were focusing on one monkey that was eating a banana, had forgotten that the other was still hooked up with the same equipment. And when they compare the data, they saw that the one that was observing the monkey eating the banana was displaying very much the same sort of data, as if there was a mirroring effect inside the brain through observation. And sure enough, by eventually looking at that, the idea of the existence of mirror neurons became real and the subject of fascination of a lot of researchers. I'm certainly not an expert in whether or not they've been officially identified, discovered, but there's a lot of controversy, it's true, around their existence. But what is real is that you cannot deny that we have this capacity to mirror or clone or duplicate behaviors we observe. And from that experience, whether it's narrative transportation, whether it's empathy, whether it's other forms of connections that we have with people that seem to be more energetic than factual, those aspects cannot be denied.
Beautiful. I love that. I love that. That the origin story of mirror neurons is an interesting one. I probably learned that in undergrad somewhere or something like that. But it was a great reminder. And to me, I try to tell people that the brain works in networks, not so trying to zone into one individual neuron to create what, like, it just has never made that much sense. But I guess I came up through a more network neuroscience lens as I was learning initially. So that origin story just really helps solidify that. So that's cool. It's cool that you had that. How did you get fascinated in neuroscience and psychology, like in the very first place in general?
It's quite simple, as a matter of fact. It is because of my frustration, my disillusion with traditional market research. I did my master's in business in the US and fell in love with the country. Came back to France, but realized that I wanted to come back. And so with much luck and probably good karma, I actually became the CEO of a French-owned company in San Francisco. I was 28 years old. I thought I knew everything I needed to know. You know, I have an MBA. I'm this French cool executive is in San Francisco running a manufacturing plant, making flags and signs and so on. And then moved on eventually to a much bigger role in corporate America as chief marketing officer of a fairly large grocery chain. And it's there that I started to spend, a lot of money, millions of dollars investigating what people were doing, why were they coming in the store, why were they picking these products, and so on. But the data was not really that reliable. And it became very obvious to me that I was only scratching the narrative that I wanted out of consumers. And a huge chunk of the narrative was never going to be shared with me because they couldn't. So much of our consumer behavior in general is not conscious. And therefore, I became very interested in neuroscience and felt that this was ultimately the new frontier. Pursued my PhD in neuroscience and established a very, you could say, radical, if not revolutionary model of understanding consumer behavior, which became neuromarketing. So I'm credited for starting, in effect, there's only a couple of people in the world that can say that, the movement of neuromarketing, which is old if you think about how long it's been now available. But what's really cool now is AI has accelerated not only its relevance, but its importance in decoding not just the conscious aspect of our behavior, but the non-conscious aspect of our behavior.
Wow.
That is amazing.
I really like that story. Were there any specific breakthroughs or just aha moments in your academic or professional life?
Well, you mentioned, Paul, that study really confirmed and established my core belief that this was the pivot for me. And I did my last job as chief marketing officer of a tech company. You guys are way too young to remember the tech bubble and these companies that were raising money from one PowerPoint slide. I did become the chief marketing officer of a company that had raised $150 million with the idea of giving away computer labs to schools so that we could create a skin to multicast ads in front of teenagers. Not exactly a very popular idea with Ralph Nader and his friends, but the concept was actually quite powerful. And even though the company ultimately did not make it, and after 2 years we went from 400 people to 8, and I was one of the 8, and I looked at the CEO and I said, what now? He said, well, just do what you love instead of trying to stick around. And so they gave me this extraordinary gift. I've never been unemployed in my entire life. And they said, well, you've done such a great job with us. We're going to give you a year of severance pay for working 2 years. You have to understand, this is a pretty amazing deal. I was recently divorced, and this is the gift, whether it's the divine or, again, karmic. And so I spent that year writing the first book with a colleague and business partner of mine called Neuromarketing. In fact, the original title was Selling to the Old Brain. And we went to Kinko's and printed, 10 of them and started doing the road trip. And of course, this is the ultimate prop. A book is wonderful, but in many ways it does establish, talk about brain impact, the fact that you know a lot. And sometimes, as you know, you've met people that either don't write the books or actually fake knowing a lot. But the brain doesn't care. As long as you can speak the enough talking points, you're going to be fine. So this book really articulated the principles of what is today Neuromap, which is the theoretical model that we've established now in many, many countries. The book has done remarkably well. It's in 14 languages now.
Got it. I like that. That's a wild. It's great segue into going more in depth. Like, was the neuromarketing book, I don't know if it was the precursor to the one that I'm reading, which is blowing my mind, or if it's just a new title or whatever it is. But I would love to I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into your expertise in that space. At the beginning of the book, you do a little bit of like Neuroscience 101, which is beautiful. I think that might be helpful here, because even something like saying the old brain to some people might not make a ton of sense. So could you just share a little bit of the neuroscience behind some of what you found initially and what you wrote about in that book? And then we can dive into how it affects consumer behavior.
Of course. Well, first of all, come back to what I was really seeking as a consumer researcher. I wanted to investigate the non-conscious or subconscious is part of the terms that I actually prefer. And so it pointed me very quickly to different layers in the brain, different brain structure. And since you have a neuroscience background, you know how confusing anatomy and locating, a brain button in the brain was ultimately going to fail. But what did not fail is the remarkable consensus that I think we have among neuroscientists, that the brain has evolved over, lots of years, millions, and as a layering process. And therefore, there's been a pretty remarkable, we don't exactly know how and why it happens, progression from primal functions, survival functions, which are essentially all hosted in the bottom part of our brain, which is what I call the primal brain. So it includes the brain stem, the cerebellum, the very small but critical structure, which has actually the highest density of neurons in the brain. And of course, what is generally described as the limbic system, which is a collection of other brain structures. But right above that, in the last, we can say probably 400,000 years, evolved much more sophisticated structures, which I call rational in nature. Of course, the technical term would be the neocortex and so forth. And so when I design experiments, I wanted to specifically target, particularly using, for instance, skin conduction techniques, which measure the degree to which people can sweat. And a lot of that response is non-conscious. I know it sounds a little crazy, but when you put a couple of electrodes, I don't know if you've ever done that, on two fingers and distribute a tiny little electrical current, and you let people watch a commercial, you will be able to record 300 times per second the degree to which that effect called sweat, which corresponds to emotional arousal, whether it's happiness or fear. We don't quite know with skin conduction what it's going to be, but we know something is happening. And most of the time, that ability to communicate the rays of what's called arousal is impossible. I mean, it takes really a long time for especially a rational brain to stop coming online and say, oh, I'm feeling fear, or I'm feeling joy. And on top of that, then we have to struggle with the choices of words. I mean, sure, most of us can speak about 500 to 1 million words, but it takes a lot of time for us to retrieve that information. So I wanted to shortcut all this verbal information, which one, I didn't trust fully because, especially in research, you have to remember, you pay people to give you the data. So, right? So they make stuff up. And not to mention, I've done my share of focus group. Then you have social pressure, ego stuff where people start, I'm going to play the guy that knows everything. And I was getting sick and tired of this traditional research. And I said, no more surveys, no more sentiment analysis, no more focus group. I'm going straight for the brain.
Let's go.
And so that's what happened. And
that's
so
amazing.
In that investigation over time, I don't want to suggest it took me, just a few years. It took me really 10 years to feel solid and confident that I wasn't a fraud. When you go from business credentials to neuroscience credential, you get a lot of resistance from neuroscientists that come from academic backgrounds. And to be honest, Paul was probably the first one, he's a big hugger, right? To say, hey, Christoph, let's do this together. And this was super helpful because I really wanted to be reliable in the way I would approach the topic. we faced a lot of resistance from marketers who were, of course, terrified at the idea that, conventional research methods, and still today, are obsolete, at least in my view. And of course, the neuroscientists, which are mostly clinical in nature, that go, this is a scandal. How can we allow people like neuromarketers to mess with our brains?
Yeah. And
so
look at where we are today.
Squeezed in those tension, which is one of the biggest priorities, is for me to, at the time, join and co-founded the Neuromarketing International Association. I wrote the ethical code for the industry. I was a very fierce advocate, and most of my early career was about training. It was about giving away, to some extent, what I have found, so that people would then go, maybe we need neuromarketing research. Maybe we need to question those methods by which we collect people's opinion and sentiment, and the rest is history.
Got it. So new brain is neocortex. It's where our intelligence is. It's where things make sense. Old brain is the primal brain, is about survival. Something just really quick. Is the hippocampus a part of the old or new brain?
It would be considered part of the primal brain.
Primal. Okay.
And certainly, of course, it's a tremendous. It's tremendously interesting to look at its role in memory, of course, formation and storage. And the storage of those memories is typically long-term memories. And what's been really fascinating, and I'm jumping to other topics here in my interest in mental health, particularly in cognitive decline issues. My father passed away from Alzheimer's, so I have had a very personal relationship to what happens in the brain when these conditions hit. And there's a distribution, as you know, Cody, of so many responsibilities in the brain. Long-term tends to reside in the old brain, and the new in the frontal lobes, the working memory. And so all of that is really this kind of fascination I have is to understand the why, and more importantly, what does it mean to the research questions that you're trying to solve? And so in neuromarketing, my research questions were, what is truly happening in the brain when people are, confronting this message? What is the visual impact? What is the emotional impact? What is the memory impact? What is the cognitive impact? So I focused a huge part of my career understanding that until I realized, well, wait a second, this can also help decoding a lot of critical aspects of our mental health. And so we can talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, for sure.
If you're interested.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about that. Maybe, Christoph, in really simple terms, could you explain the core principles of neuromarketing to someone that's just a regular consumer?
Yes. So obviously, the term itself, which is credited to have been first used by Dr. Elliot Schmidt, a really fascinating professor of marketing, he's Dutch, is the merge of the teaching of both neuroscience and marketing. And so from that perspective, we look at specifically brain activity to examine the relationship that we have between products and socials, media, and so forth. And so as a result, in neuromarketing, you can expect terms that sometimes can be a little confusing that come from neuroscience. The existence of the brain, of course, we all know we have one, though it's not always obvious from what we see in the news. But most people deny the existence of their primal brain structure. I mean, so many times have I been in situations because I've spoken extensively to a network called the Vistage Network. Do you know Vistage? It's our largest CEO organization. And
I know Vistage well. That's cool.
Oh, you do? Yeah. I'm probably one of their top speakers of all time. I've done maybe 2,000 presentations. So being in front of CEOs all over the U.S. and the world gave me an opportunity to really bounce back reactions from people saying, what are you talking? I'm running a $2 billion company. I use my rational brain, I use my logic and so on. And of course, until they realize, and the big help, frankly, I owe a tremendous, credit to, of course, Kahneman, because Kahneman, as a psychologist and investigator of cognitive biases, made this model, the dual brain model, which in the more academic literature is called the System 1, System 2 model. And if you know that model, basically System 1 maps to Primal. So this tells you that we have this early form of response in our brain. That's why it's called System 1. That is driven by survival, by restoring homeostasis in our nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the branch of the nervous system that is constantly monitoring whether we are in fight or flight, is indeed using its power to also regulate many of our cognitive functions. And that is often either poorly known or completely denied. So teaching this to people is very important, that we have more than one brain. We really have two. They collaborate, but one is more dominant than the other. And whether you accept it or not, I've collected for 20 years the evidence that even when you buy a $2 million software, your primal brain is going to largely dominate the speed and the nature of your decisions. Kahneman did the same thing. He got the Nobel Prize for doing this work. I'm still waiting for it. I'm just joking.
It's on its way. So the primal brain is the one making decision, and the newer brain is the one, system, I think one in that concept is the one that justifies the purchase, essentially. Is that directionally
accurate?
One
is the primal. So think of it as one. I know it's a terrible name protocol, which is why I decided to establish more the notion of primal and rational.
I like that way better.
Does that. I love his work, Dr. Eagleman, and a few others. But it's the same stuff. And you have to understand, Kahneman was not a neuroscientist either. He became very fluent in many of the concepts. His descriptions sometimes do not fit the neuroscientific knowledge to the extent that you would suspect. So, but he did this remarkable work of at least telling us all shit. Not so much that the primal will make decisions, but the primal has huge influence in dominating and influencing decisions. And so I want to give people a chance to recognize that if you're aware of that dominance, it actually gives you more power to tame the beast, if you will.
And there is research that shows that if people's primal brain, the emotional centers of their nervous system, are cut off or damaged in some way, they struggle to make decisions. Isn't that, I know I've seen that research. Isn't that a thing?
Yeah, the poster child of this type of research is Damasio. Antonio Damasio, a fabulous researcher I had the pleasure to meet during a conference in neuromarketing, was really the first researcher to say, wait a second, let's stop demonizing, first of all, emotions. I have to understand, again, when I did my MBA many years ago, in the leadership course that I took, emotions were considered bad for leaders. Kind of emotional response, any kind of emotional response was coded as reducing your ability to make decisions, which is now the exact opposite of what we understand. We need to recruit our emotional system, and emotions are largely managed, you could say, in the hub of the primal brain. Now, with emotions, what's interesting, and Damasio does that very well, and so does Ledoux, absolutely an extraordinary author, neuroscientist who's focused his work on anxiety and understanding the threshold or the progression that we go in from emotions, which are essentially chemical responses that are completely non-conscious, and feelings. And feelings become more conscious over time and give us a chance, if you will, to catch up to the chemical and the flooding of our nervous system with hormones and neurotransmitters. And feelings become, at the threshold of our consciousness, you could say, between the primal and the rational, an opportunity to say, oh, I'm sad. Oh, I'm scared. And so all of this to say that, of course, if you cut off emotions, then you cut off feelings. If you got feelings, you don't have the critical information to know in which direction you should orient your decision. So decisioning in the brain, I'm absolutely convinced, in the rational brain, cannot be purely factual, cannot be purely logical. I think that's where AI is, in a way. AI is doing the reverse evolution. And I'm passionate about AI since I teach AI for Johns Hopkins. And to me, this is the first time I say it, this is part of how I am. I think that AI is going through a reverse evolutionary process as humans have.
That is so fascinating to think about. That makes so much sense. Because some of the initial AI was like positrons and like trying to mirror the neocortex, which is the like this like rational brain.
Yeah,
and now we're just
networks.
starting to get emotions. Yeah,
that's right. So the fascination, you have to understand the fascination of most neuroscience, and the books that I have from Gazzaniga and cognitive neuroscience, the Bible that is just so incredible.
I have it right in front of me.
Mostly giving space to cognition, to yes, a sensory system, but really looking at the upstairs of the brain and say, oh yeah, and then we have these primal structures, the amygdala, blah blah blah. Well, wait a second, we have more neurons going, communicating from the primal to the rational than we have from rational to the primal. That should be right there, a pretty big clue of who is in charge.
That is wild. So it's this primal brain that is at kind of the center of neuromarketing. Like if they were core principles, that's it.
For me it is, and of course I'm biased because of my own work. But to go back to your question, Chloe, it's really the field that investigates, of course, yet again, the neuroscientific data that we can collect. Now, in my case, it's been shared between my fascination for primal activity. So I just mentioned skin conduction. Another type of data which is critical is, of course, the biometric data. Even though in neuromarketing it's rarely solid enough or clear enough. There's a lot of noise, if you will, in some of the data that we get from the heart or even from the skin. But there are good data sets that we can get, and I know that's been the pursuit of Paul a lot, to try to mimic or at least convert data that comes biometrically into higher level, higher order data like feelings and emotions and so on. But it's quite complicated, and less so now with AI, because when I did neuromarketing studies 10, 15 years ago, I would have gigabytes per subject. When you do a survey, you have to understand, when you do a survey, you have 50 questions, 4 answers, you have 200 variables. We're moving from 200 variables to gigabytes, and so we had to spend an enormous amount of time in labs to crank data and use these Python and R and all these really crazy complicated software. Now I can do this on my ChatGPT in seconds.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm really curious. So from this research, are there certain biomarkers or ranges of biomarkers that, if you're creating an ad, you're like, oh, if I can just elicit this response from somebody within this zone, maybe, this level of sweat, this much dopamine is like too much dopamine, not enough dopamine. Are there certain biomarkers now that you've identified where these are like the golden ones that you're trying to press with advertising and marketing?
So I wish it was that simple, but it isn't. And as much as you see people mentioning dopamine, in every sentence on how our craving are formulated and so on, certainly in a clinical setting, you can run tests that will specifically measure dopamine response and so on, but it's very invasive. And I don't run studies where I tell people, I tell you what, I'm going to draw blood and or saliva, and we're going to see what happens. Now, crazy enough, Paul did that. And I always remember, because when I visited his lab, he said, my other code name is Dracula, because he had these freezers, next to his office in Claremont.
Yeah.
Have you guys been to his lab? It's a riot.
No, I want to go so bad. I haven't been there.
Yeah. And then he goes, yeah, we have freezers because when we do these experiments, and of course he does experiments mostly with students, what are students going to do for $50? Everything, if you don't kill them, right? So, and I did my dissertation inviting students also. So I have huge respect for them. I did a study with him using synthesized oxytocin. I'm sure you've heard of oxytocin through him. And I was quite fascinated to investigate with him the direct effect of elevated levels of oxytocin. So we had to administer through a nose spray that we legally obtained with federal approval. It took 2 years to get the IRB, which is the Internal Review Board committee. And it's a joke, really. That's why science is so slow. And that's why it takes 3 years to publish a paper. And by the time you do, it's already obsolete. So I learned all of this. And back to your question, biomarkers to me are not exactly the right way to look at what you seek to identify. I've always focused on, I think, concepts that marketers are familiar with. Marketers are not familiar with dopamine. They don't understand what it is, its role. It's such a complex, both neurotransmitter and hormone. And yes, we do know the existence of these critical neurotransmitters, but when you start getting into serotonin and others, it's just very, very complex. But if you say to a marketer, I would like to help you figure out if your ad is creating emotional arousal, because there is really good evidence that an emotional response is going to guide people to a decision, then you have to focus on that. So how can I measure emotional arousal? Back to your question. Well, we can certainly do this with skin conduction. We can do this also by decoding facial expressions. The grandfather of facial coding gave us this incredible model that as humans, we have in fact you could say a common set of facial responses to specific emotions. And so initially the work that you had to do was to observe and slow down the video so that you can identify codes on people's face. You may be familiar with this remarkable show called Lie to Me. But then it became a software that we can now use in neuromarketing experiments where people are simply relaxing in front of a camera, and we can identify through that software if they're happy, sad, or frustrated. So the biomarkers in that case become physical language that is given by our facial expression. For skin conduction, the biomarker is actually the release of water, a process called sweat, which is run by autonomic nervous system. And so all these biomarkers have, I think, now gotten enough research depth that we can continue to examine them. Now, in the heart rate space, HRV has become an interesting biomarker, certainly of emotional resilience, or what's called vagal tone. But it's not, at least for marketing purposes, it's not a data point that we can easily correlate to buying decisions. I was really on a mission to always look at research questions and biomarkers that would ultimately help me answer critical questions. Are people paying attention? Have you managed to hijack and do so legally and ethically enough energy into the brain so that people can actually know what it is that they're looking at? Are they moving in a direction, whether it's positive or negative? Are they doing so with a certain cognitive flow? So measuring cognitive effort is something you can do with an EEG. With an EEG, you can also measure what's called frontal asymmetry. You may have heard of that, but when our brain is already really primed, if you will, at the old layer level to make a decision, we can catch with EEG machines, which have sensors directly on the surface of the brain, whether the right or the left frontal lobe is more active. And this asymmetry has been proven for a very long time to correlate to decision. Left dominance leads to decision, right dominance leads to avoidance. And this is used, in fact, in clinical setting a lot.
How good is neuromarketing? Like you are a master in neuromarketing. If a company hired you and they wanted you to create some ads or create something, to talk to them about their algorithm, how confident are you could get someone to do what you wanted them to do? How good are we at this?
Yeah, I'm very confident. And you asked earlier, what is Persuasion Code compared to these other books? The other books, which now are dated, Neuromarketing was our first really sort of published book with Penguin, but that was in 2005. So 20 years ago, the confidence I had as an investigator of neuroscience was quite low. We had good hypotheses, if you will, and we were testing them and educating the market. And once I became truly a neuromarketing researcher, being coached and mentored by Paul, being properly educated through a PhD, I developed the confidence to use these tools to not break the law, to not hurt anybody, to put people into situations of investigation that would not modify their behavior. You've heard of functional MRI, I'm sure. fMRI is still used a lot in neuromarketing, but if you've ever been in an fMRI, I have, it's impossible not to be extremely stressed and extremely compromised as a subject. And so it concerns me that so much findings, particularly on neuromarketing, have ultimately been collected through fMRI because I think it's too intrusive to be extremely reliable. Not to mention there are critical ethical issues that ultimately can surface because, for instance, if you do a random fMRI, the probability that they meaning the radio physiologist looking at the data, find anything abnormal can be north of 15%. So what do you do with that? Do you tell people, I'm sorry, I think I've seen a tumor in your brain? I didn't want to get into that. I didn't want to get into the responsibility of sharing information that was not the intention of the research.
Yeah, that's a wild time. So then I guess companies, we hear about the algorithm all the time. Chloe and I are both creators. We hear about companies that are able to like hack your brain. Like, how good are neuromarketers today at taking the principles that you and your colleagues have researched over years and applying it into the consumer space? Like, how good are we at this?
I think we're really good. I think that the reason I wanted to publish Persuasion Code, you could say 15 years later, literally, is because we had collected so much evidence. There's 30 business cases in the book. I had published quite extensively in other fields of study. So it was no longer considered a pseudoscience, and it's certainly not considered that today, even though we faced so much skepticism, so much most aggression and accusation of behaving in a way that is just not normal or ethical. Looking back at some of those papers on, the problems of ethics in neuromarketing, and I teach this stuff with students. I tell them, okay, of course, there's all these threats that this is going to be Big Brother, or, the neuromarketers are going to implant chips in your brain before you know it. I asked them to play that role, and I said, find the evidence that there are people that have behaved that way, and they couldn't. Now, does it mean that there are marketers that are terribly unethical and we don't see it? Yes, and part of the problem of calling those that are really manipulating or biohacking behind your back all your behavior is that we didn't have the tools and the measures and the software, if not the framework, to call their behavior. And so you could say it's my way of justifying that I did something good by publishing the book, because I know it can enable, it's the story of the hammer. The hammer is a great tool, but it could be also a pretty effective weapon. I was quite aware of the dual possibility, and at the same time, I figured, well, if I have, I think, a credible model to decode how people can manipulate our subconscious, well, Persuasion Code will help do that.
Got it.
What, in your opinion, what are the top ways that we are getting manipulated as consumers? Like, what are some of the tactics we should be looking out for?
Yeah, a note, and if you could put this in the credit, the wonderful researcher, and I've had the pleasure to be trained by him, that created the facial coding system, is Paul Ekman. And because of Kahneman, Ekman, for some bizarre reason, they're scrambled in my brain. But Paul was the executive producer of Lie to Me, and also the key psychologist consulting for Inside Out. And if you haven't seen the movie, it's a fabulous movie, not just for kids, but for adults, to understand the nature of our emotions. So back to your question, which was, sorry.
So what are some of the top manipulation tactics in the sales and marketing world that as consumers we need to be aware of and look out for?
Yes. So, of course, and going back to, has neuromarketing fueled more manipulation than existed before? It's likely, but advertising is not a young discipline. And I would argue that for thousands of years, humans have aimed to manipulate in one way or another, whether it's to speak ideas and views and opinions about religion, about policies and so on. But it's true, what has enabled more manipulation in some way is the combination of media platforms and neuromarketing, more so than just neuromarketing. And as you know, the social media platforms have developed such sophisticated algorithm to create loops that questionably take advantage of information often shared without knowledge that the information is going to be used to nudge, which is another term that is used and quite popular in neuromarketing, to nudge in a way that frankly takes advantage of people. So what has always bothered me, and to be honest, about Facebook and many others, is their ability to develop these algorithms that are not explicitly disclosed. And of course, Cambridge Analytica revealed this to be a massive problem. And frankly, that explains why I was initially told not to say anything about neuromarketing studies at Facebook. Because these loops exist and will continue to exist. My new course at Johns Hopkins is about neuromarketing AI. And so neuromarketing AI is really this augmented field of neuromarketing where we're looking at more and more technology that is giving marketers the capacity to capture and recycle information and reuse that information, whether it's consented or not, to manipulate people into behaviors or decisions that are not necessarily what people want. And so one of the most quoted film that has already warned us about that is, of course, Minority Report. And if you guys have not seen the movie, you need to watch it 10 times because it's one of the most extraordinary movie of all time in science fiction. And now there is investigation of how much was actually 20 years ago predicted in Israel now.
Dang. So based on this, all the manipulation, all the nudging, all the things, you did also mention earlier, you helped write a code of ethics for some of these things. What are some of the pillars of the code of ethics that you wrote for neuromarketing?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, there's this concept which unfortunately, I have to say, in the United States is not taken as seriously as it is in Europe, for instance, of vulnerable targets. And in vulnerable targets, you're looking specifically at typically young people and people maybe older who face cognitive decline and become in some way more gullible, and they exert less filters, if you will, in the way they accept information. And so those populations are clearly at more risk of manipulation. What's really interesting about young population, and I did my entire dissertation on that, is, and if you have children, I don't know what age bracket they are, you should know that the last part of their brain, unfortunately, will not mature until the mid-20s. And I'm talking about frontal lobes, I'm talking about the software that we have to actually recognize and to some extent filter or put the brakes on our impulsivity. So impulsivity here is, of course, at stake, right? When you talk about manipulation, you're talking about the ability to break through all the filters that we have, the cognitive filters that we have, to examine the importance or the safety of a decision. So I would say, and I proved it in my dissertation, that anybody under the age of, let's say, 20 or 22 is at risk. Now, if you interview these young people, and I've had, I have two young boys that are now in their 30s, there's no, question they're smart. There's no question that they sometimes display far more intelligence than we do as adults. But they are lacking this critical piece of software, which is why, by the way, when you look at the data of, incarcerated people or the data behind major mental health disorders today, it's totally correlated with weak frontal lobe. Eagleman really did the best work any neuroscientist could do, I feel, by going into prisons and examine, the conditions of these filters. And he came up with this stunning number in the book, The Brain of You, which is one of my favorite books of all time, by saying, I can conclude that nearly 50% of all people who are incarcerated have massive disorders of the frontal lobe. So my point is, the vulnerable people are what I wanted to protect. And so in the Code of Ethics, we did this disclaimer and say, do not, and we invited people who would be members, do not do research on minors, number one. Call the risks that are real of having less cognitive ability not just to recognize an ad. See, in the US, the test was for the longest time, can a 9-year-old recognize that this is an advertising? And yes, a 9-year-old is going to recognize that, oh, this is an ad. And so we consider in the US, even today, this is absolutely absurd, that this is enough protection. So there's no laws to regulate, the creation and distribution of advertising to minors. Now,
goodness.
Nordic countries, they have established laws to do that. And it's certainly not with this current administration. It's not going to be anytime soon that we see more of those protection. It concerns me. And so ethics, I learned, is a beautiful word, but you can't enforce it.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. If there's no regulation or threats, people do ultimately what they want.
I'm really curious, what's your take on this? Do you think minors or, young children that are so susceptible to programming, do you think they should be using social media?
Well, it can't. Okay, so I'm going to provide a measured answer. Social media is like AI. It's here to stay. So what we need to do, though, is really provide more education, literacy, and bring teaching and education at the level of high school on the risk of being addicted to media behaviors. And addiction is not just limited to substance abuse. It's as real when kids are watching their phone, 500 to 600 times a day, when they're spending an average of 4 hours a day on their phone. So the risk is that level of addiction. There are parents that have the power and use their will to do that with their own children, but there are many that just give up. And so in school environments, I was a CEO of a French school for some time in San Francisco. This is very, very problematic because you can see how dysfunctional and the only option in a school environment is indeed to ask the kids to leave their phone before getting into the school. And so you have to get to that level of guardrails, if you will, but forbidding it or cancel, I don't think it's necessary or even possible.
Dang. Yeah, I feel that. It's a wild time. The Anxious Generation is an interesting book around data around social media and young brains, especially female or like women, girl brains. So it's a wild time. This kind of brings me to a curiosity. What's the biggest myth in your field, neuromarketing or persuasion, that just won't die, that drives you crazy?
Oh, there's many. The separation of the hemispheric activity is
my God, that drives me nuts. Yes, please educate us.
Left brain right now? Are you being right?
Oh my God, it drives me crazy when people talk like that. Please bust that myth right now. Bust the right brain, left brain specialization myth.
The truth is, neuroscience is a very young field. We have collected in the last 5 years about 95% of what we know. And so we just begin just simply to scratch the surface. So 20 years ago, when people had somehow identified, and you can through very basic experimentation, which is based on what you can observe, what you can see, not what you can decode in the brain. There could have been some aspects of the research at the time that suggested a certain dominance of the left over the right. The left evidence is a little more compelling to some extent because we know, for instance, that language functions are hosted in 95% of our brain on the left hemisphere, in the left temporal lobe. And we know that because, of course, for the most part, neuroscience was based on injuries and disease. And of course, war became the lab of brain science, because when people show up, with a spear in the left hemisphere and they can't talk, well, you go, there must be a correlation. Correlations, reverse engineering has fueled neuroscience for the longest time until it got debunked. And so while we can point at certain areas specifically that do correlate to certain processing functions like language, overall we know that the brain is highly distributed, and that this notion that there is a separation of labor between right and left is just completely ridiculous. Now, at the same time, you could argue, well, Christoph, you have divided into as well. There's more evidence of that.
That's honestly, I've never thought about it. That is a good point. Old brain versus new brain is a division, but not one that has the corpus callosum connecting them. And it's like, dude, if you're doing a complicated math problem,
I have to say, because of Chloe's presence, I'm going to really, do something to, like a Frenchman to make a woman so special. The corpus callosum, as you know, is this band of tissue that correlates both hemisphere, and it happens to be thicker in the female brain. And so some people argue that this may explain why women have naturally more ability to see the big picture, because there is more transfer of information between both hemispheres, and men tend to be more specialized. So this is one of those theories that has gained a lot of credit among dating circles.
This is
That's
fascinating.
Freaking awesome. That's cool. I like that.
There's some truth to it.
To me, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, I said that to my wife.
Surprise, surprise.
Who's a psychologist.
No, that's cool. I love that. Yeah, I mean, I wrote a blog recently. If you really stop and actually think about it, if you're doing a math problem, you have to be creative to figure out novel ways to solve that problem, and you have to be logical to do the math. So like, there's almost nothing you could do. Or if you're doing art, you have to be creative to do that, but then you also have aspect ratios and like contrast and stuff that you need to be logical about. So it's like, if you really stop and actually think about it, it's like, that doesn't make that much sense.
Well, two things that also fascinated me. I, of course, like most scientists, wanted to know more about Einstein's brain. He gave it to science, and people started to poke at it and look at, the possibility that it would be bigger, this pseudoscience in the 18th century, where people were really looking at correlations between size of the brain or bumps on the brain, which was, of course, ridiculous. But what they did find, nothing really special in terms of mass. They did find that he had exceptional myelinization inside his brain. So myelin is a coating around the axons. I'm going to be a little bit technical here, Chloe, but you've heard we have neurons. These are brain cells. 20% of all the cells in the brain are called neurons, and neurons are essentially transmitting information both electrically and chemically. And that transmission is very much like electrical transmission. You need cable, right? Is done through cables, which are called axons. But these axons need, sort of protection so that the transmission is good and clean. And that protection is called myelin. And you can take supplements, actually, and I recommend that for anybody who wants to speed up the transmission of information in their brain. Well, it turns out that apparently Einstein's brain was like oiled like this fabulous machine. But what do you think that does? It speeds up transmission back and forth anywhere in the brain. And so I think ultimately intelligence, consciousness is going to be a correlation between the speed at which we transmit information and the speed at which we travel in different areas of the brain.
I love that. Myelin is one of my favorite glial cells. In relation to the thing that always helped me so much with myelin is imagining a neuron like a water hose. Yeah. And if you think of a hose and you poke a bunch of holes in that hose, the output of water at the very end gets weaker because there's water pushing out all over the place. But if you wrap it in duct tape and you close all those holes, the flow at the end increases a lot. Myelin is like the duct tape. And that was always such a great analogy to help me understand.
And by the way, you just described Parkinson.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay, well, now I'm really curious. I want to know how to increase myelination and be more like Einstein.
No kidding.
Well, then we need to move to my recent book because it was really through these teachings that I started to, realize, wait a second, I can do so much more with my own brain. How can I do that? How can I improve my myelinization? How can I improve my consciousness? How can I get rid of all this toxicity that I get with unconscious mental maladaptive behaviors like stress, anxiety, addiction, and so on. So Open was really this opportunity to pivot into another level, if you will, of understanding of the brain. But if it's not the right time, I'll be patient.
Yeah, I will bring us to that, I promise. What I want, there's two things. First, something you just said, and then the primal stimuli, I want to get to that. Because that blew my mind when I was reading your book.
Yeah.
I really want to get there. One thing really quickly, you said it in passing, but you mentioned that 20% of the cells in the brain are neurons. That leaves 80% of the brain for what? Like glial cells? Like what makes up the other percentages?
You just said it. I mean,
okay.
I'm not going to bore you with all the technical word because we have so many names for glial cells. That's what it is. 80% is glial cells. And it's a little bit like how much I told you initially, neuroscientists have paid so much more attention, I believe, to the neocortex and not as much to the, to the brainstem and the limbic system. Same is true in biology. The cells, the star cells are neurons because we talk about it all the time. We talk about, as we should, we talk about the direct effect of really bad habits like over drinking and others in literally killing neurons, and neurons are all we got. We can produce some, and you mentioned the hippocampus earlier, and it's been well established that we can actually do what's called neurogenesis, which is the creation and birth of new neurons in the hippocampus. But if we don't use them, we lose them. So by and large, we have, at least in the neocortex, all the neurons that we will ever have. And so all we can do really is optimize them. And there is a natural optimization that is provided by glial cells. Think of glial cells as the cleaners, and the ones that establish and say, hey, there's a leak there. We maybe better patch it. So we obviously need to be very aware of what we can do to those cells. And at the same time, we need to recognize that there are ways and methods to become healthier in our brain. It's only 2% of our body mass. It happens to be the largest ratio of any known species on Earth, and humans have decided this is going to be the measure of our intelligence. We're going to obviously find what we need to find as human to say we are, of course, the most intelligent species on Earth. I really don't think so. We have a retreat center called Menta Soul. We're divers, my wife and I, and we've been swimming with these remarkable creatures, and I tell you, they seem to be way smarter than we are.
I love that. Yeah, I've always called them glial cells, but glial cells, either way, there's always been some of my favorite, especially microglia. I love them and how they help. People talk about pruning neurons as you age.
Of course.
Microglia are the ones that are doing the pruning, and so it's just cool. And then one of my favorite words to say is oligodendrocyte, which is another glial cell. I love that word.
It's very
cool.
Poetic. When you start saying, glial cells, you're basically a brain nerd like you, Cody.
Dude, truly. Chloe's a brain nerd too. She like.
Oh, okay, Chloe.
She loves it.
I didn't mean to dismiss your
I would say my
interest.
background's not in neuroscience, but I do love it and appreciate it.
Here's the bottom line, and I really insisted on that in all my talks around the world. Neuroscience is for everybody. It's not just for the neuroscientists. So neuroscientists that kind of put their cover and say, "Well, don't touch that." It's like, come on, dude. We need all to have a better education, better understanding. My son was born with a disorder that we began to understand only when he was 6 years old, which is Tourette syndrome, and it's a very complex disorder, and I credit him and his struggle and his ultimately wins for being my best teacher of neuroscience, because so much can be learned from decoding a complex behavior like Tourette, uncontrollable tics, but that's the visible part. Tourette has impact on all kinds of aspects in the brain related to habits and addictions and attention and so on. So he became this incredible lab, if you will, from which, however, together we were able to approach and solve many of his behavioral and psychological issues.
Wow, I love that. That's amazing. So I could talk about support cells all day, but I would really love to hit on these primal stimuli before we dive into open, because that really opened my brain, and the quadrants even, and how it just blew my mind. So let's talk about primal stimuli first. If we get to neuroquadrants, cool. But I think this will help a lot of consumers.
Yeah. So we've defined neuromarketing as basically the study of brain activity to understand behavior. Because of my background as a media psychologist and a concentration in neuropsychology, I was, of course, fascinated by what we can do, not just to understand the effect of a website, a web page, a commercial, a movie, and so on, but to come up with best practices, right? And so it took me a while to create the data, mostly by looking at bad ads, good ads, and as a media psychologist, that's the raw material that we have to reverse engineer whether or not this had the makeup, some sort of a formula. I was looking for a formula, and you saw in my book, I have a formula. I've basically taught to hundreds of thousands of people. And the formula is ultimately that because of the dominance of the primal brain, we need to recognize the urgency that we have, whether it's conscious or not, to solve problems, situations, I call that pains or frustrations that we cannot tolerate. So the first variable that is critical to predicting and decoding the effect of any message is the degree to which it is correctly and potently pointing at pains that people struggle with. And those pains can be, again, lack of sales, lack of response, etc. The second variable is what you say to solve that pain. It's basically the medicine, right? And I've identified a concept that is used in different way called claims. So think in advertising and marketing, people will call that brand benefits and whatever. But I like the word claim because I am an inventor. My father was an inventor. And when you invent something, you have to prove that it's unique. Otherwise, you don't get a patent. And the way you articulate that is through claims. So I say in all my teachings and in my book that we have 3 shots at putting out our claims because our frontal lobes cannot go beyond 3 blocks of information. That's a very well-established, principle of neuroscience. So you better do a really good job articulating those claims and then presenting the evidence behind those claims, which I call the gain. Kahneman told us that any kind of decision, whether it's to get married or buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks, which is at the same price as $7.50 in Honolulu, you still have in your brain some sort of trade-off activity. What am I getting and what I have to let go of? And this is what I call the gain. And Kahneman did the math because he was prodigious at it and managed to figure out that in general, we expect 2.5 times more than what we pay for, okay? So pain, claim, gain is what I call the construction of a value proposition. It's the map from which we are ready now to create a message. And the last step of our model is let's go and basically unpack pain, claim, gain into a message that the primal brain will find compelling. Because you need to speak and convince the primal brain first. As Kahneman has established, as I have as well in the marketing way, we are totally dominated by the primal brain first, by system 1 first, okay? So what does that mean? Well, I've identified, and I'll make it short, 6 qualities your messages should have. And this is what Cody says is called the 6 stimuli. Now, choice of words are very important for me. And so what do you think about stimuli? What does that make you think about when you use a stimuli? It's meant to create a reaction, right? It's meant to be...
that's what I was kind of thinking. Stimulus response. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Stimulus response. That's what I was kind of thinking, yeah.
So you have to recognize that when I say 6 stimuli, I mean 6 types of responses that I've studied and measured in the brain for 20 years. It's not just these branding, maps that you see, especially in social media, for which there is no evidence, for which the words are cryptic or misdefined and so on. So we're talking 6 outcomes that are measurable. Okay? Number 1, personal, which is basically the extent to which you are tapping into pain relevance. If indeed the primal brain is going to dominate, you can't hit me with benefits right away. You can't hit me with solutions, which 99% of all the ads do. It's too fast, too soon. If you're selling me an extinguisher, I'm not interested in an extinguisher, but if you remind me that if I don't have one, my house could burn and so many things could happen to lives of people I care deeply about or things I care deeply about. You got to light the fire under people's chair before you sell them the extinguisher. This is not from me. This is from David Ogilvy. And if you know a little bit about the advertising space, this is one of the most brilliant advertisers of all time. He was a copywriter.
Yeah, legend.
Okay, all right. So that's what personal does. It's measuring the extent to which you're reawakening that pain, because that is what you're buying to receive attention. And without attention, you have nothing. I mean, you scroll on Instagram, we all do. And the first point is the first point of attention. And attention is going to be triggered and possible through primal brain activity only. We don't read in milliseconds. We don't think in milliseconds. We see or we notice. This is called saliency, right? So when you have two elements and they're blurry together, there's no saliency. When they're sharp, when you're showing people the difference between having that pain and solving it, that's saliency. Okay? Second concept, related, is contrast. Contrast is the ability to tell a story that will move people almost without thinking into one solution. You show them the pain, you tell them the gain, you're moving them automatically to the gain. So you're making decisions so easy through contrast that you can tell an entire story in milliseconds. And so when people apply contrast, I tell them to make their claims situations of contrast. If you tell me you're going to be good at this, that's not a contrast. But if you show me something really, a vendor, a competitor, and say they're really bad at solving this problem of extinguishing your house without figuring out how to manipulate this very, very complicated, extinguisher. Show me the very complicated extinguisher so that in my primal brain, I'm like, where's the good one? Ah, here it is. That's contrast, okay? So we've done tons of studies of testing these principles, testing them visually, testing them in claims, etc. The third one is tangible. The brain, particularly in the primal brain, doesn't have neurons to read. It doesn't have it actually has a bit of neurons to compute. So we can do basic math. So can birds, by the way. But by and large, we're limited to what the primal brain is supposed to do, which is to keep us alive. And those responses do not invite for cognitive processing at all. And so we have to stop creating hooks. And I know our systems, whether it's Google and social media and so on, is so tech-centric, but we're moving away quickly to these kinds of needs, if you will, into a space where it's more visual and more intuitive, if you will. And that is going to match more the preference of the primal brain. So tangible is to present the evidence that cannot be objected, that cannot be denied, if it's visual, if it's through a story, if it's through an object. I recommend, for instance, that salespeople use props. I carry, when I sell, I know this is mostly an audio performance, though I'm sure you make it into a video, but I never leave my office without this, right? Why? Because I know when I say I'm a neuroscientist, it's just a word. You may not even know what it means. But if I say I know a lot about this because I've spent 20 years of my existence poking at it and learning how it responds to advertising and media. So the physical presence of that object makes it real, makes it believable, right? So far, so good?
Got it. All right, so we got personal, contrastable, and tangible are the first three.
Oh, did you notice it rhymes on purpose? Why? Because rhyming makes it easy for our brain to remember. We spend an enormous amount of time finding those words. Even pain, claim, gain. I can remember with my partner, very heated conversation. We're both French, which is kind of weird if you think about it, about the choice of words. But we were determined to make our method memorable. And a lot of people talk about neuromap, which is the name of the method, as the pain, claim, gain method. So moving on to this, and there is, as you can see, there's a bit of an arc here. You capture the attention, you make it easy for people to understand the direction in which you are going, which is to solve critical pain points. And you have evidence for it. You're not just bullshitting everybody, which 99% of all advertisers do. They expect just words alone to make you believe it's true. That doesn't work, in the primal brain especially. Now we need to insist on making the message or the story sticky. And so the fourth one is memorable. And so the study of memory has taught me something really important that is commonly known but rarely used in advertising. And that is, for instance, that we tend to remember best what is at the beginning of an interaction and what is at the end, and we tend to forget everything in the middle. George Lucas famously said, making a blockbuster is easy. Hot opening, hot close, try not to screw up in the middle. Every one of our...
That's awesome.
Cody, do you remember your first car?
Yeah, Ford Taurus.
Yeah. Do you remember your current car?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
You
do.
remember the
Yeah.
second, the third. You'll find with any kind of experience that we have trouble coming back into the middle of an experience. For shoppers, it's very important. I was in chief marketing officer of a large grocery store, and at the time, I didn't do neuromarketing. I was just basically observing and doing so legally, legally disclosed cameras. And I watched hundreds of hours of the most boring footage you can imagine of people walking through the aisles and looking at and staring at, products, especially when there are too many. But I started noticing patterns. Of course, that's my fascination of what people pay attention to at the beginning of the store and at the end. And also understanding that the beginning is the opportunity to send a message of wholeness, of cleanness in a store. We would put the bread section there. We would put flour section at the beginning because you're now, inviting people to come into this environment,
Wow.
which often is perceived as being, disgusting. Walmart has used, greeters, older people. You can't not smile back to, the people that are.
They're
of a certain
hacking
age.
our
I'm doing
brains.
that. So it's a brilliant move. I know they get their money worth, and I know they don't do it just because they're that generous. They just want to create the environment of a friendly environment, and they do that remarkably well. And the other thing that is critical, and we spent in our company at the time a lot of money, making sure people at the cashier were well trained, polite, and would take the time, which very few people do. In our case, this was a discount environment called Grocery Outlet. There still exists today. And we would remind people by circling, in stabilo in that highlighter yellow, that they had saved $22.50. And the line was, wonderful, you've saved, and looking at them, you've saved $22.50 for your family today. Have a great one. So you enter the store with the, confirmation that it's professionally run, that the stuff is not going to be short, you're not going to find veggies that are dying. And then at the end, you have this human touch, this human, knowledge of confirmation of how good you are. Bingo.
Oh my goodness.
So this
Neuromarketing.
notion of memorability is to, first of all, limit your claims. We just simply do not have the ability to remember much. In fact, most of our brain, frankly, is wired to forget. We need the space. And as you get older, like me, you actually find that the brain is as powerful. I've never felt as good in my brain, even though I had this moment of absence of Ekman. But I pay a lot of attention to my brain health. And I do think that, especially as you age, there are very well-known and treatable aspects, which is sleep, and reduction of substances like alcohol, especially. So memorability is a concept that people achieve through limiting the claims, repeating the claims. I know how annoying in marketing it is to repeat, but the truth is there's a very subtle message that we have received when we were young children. Repetition means authority. Repetitions mean it's important. And repetition is ultimately going to help our brain stick that information. So beginning and end and repetition. Fifth, now we're getting into something really big, emotions. It's pretty clear. I'm not saying anything marketers don't know, but I mean, so many messages are flat, neutral. So many marketers play it safe, and they have always the good reasons for, we can't go there, it's too negative. We can't go there because, in our space, they're accountants or engineers, as if to suggest that accountants and engineers don't feel anything.
Right.
I mean, I've had those conversations. I mean, I joke about it now, but it's like I shake people up like you have no idea. You can probably guess by now. It's like, come on, let's look at science, what science says about, ads. And so it's very obvious in the B2B space, not as much in the business to consumer space. And in fact, in the business to consumer space, I would say it's the opposite. I mean, you look at, Super Bowl type ads. I've tested them 2 years in a row. And it's they will somehow reach some sort of emotional cocktail, but there's no sense to it. It's like being in a discotheque and under stroboscopic lights. There's something really weird, but you have zero memory of it, no point to it, and so on. It's crap. And we're talking millions and millions of dollars that's purely wasted. And so my
Jeez.
studies are not always welcomed by marketers. As a matter of fact, you can imagine I'm not extremely popular among advertisers or top marketers because I'm a threat to their self-limiting beliefs.
Jeez. They could use your information and be growth
Many
have a growth
many
mindset. Yeah,
They are the rogue, they are the revolutionary, they are the ones that are ready to listen, that are ready to consider the evidence.
well, count me in.
Yeah.
I
And
love
of course,
being
the
a
last
rebel.
one. So emotions is a big topic. I could talk about it forever. But you guys know that emotions, I mentioned that, are basically chemicals. You know those chemicals are released below our level of consciousness for a very good reason. And I believe it is to orient our decisions. It is orienting our behavior at the speed that we need when we are seeking to survive. And so we have this system in place, which, and go back to Damasio did prove through his experiments that people who have diseased emotional systems cannot make decisions. I've been in situations where I was, particularly during COVID, pretty depressed. I couldn't make a move. I couldn't make a decision. So we need decision. We need that software, that nudge that comes from our emotion. And as advertisers or media, makers, we have the wonderful option of deciding which emotion we need, right? So we have an array. Of course, you can go into very sophisticated systems, but I use a very simple system in breaking down emotions into two buckets. Okay. This is one of the most interesting model of all time in emotions, knowing that we probably have thousands of emotions that we can experiment. So you can't use one. You can't say, I'm seeking joy, I'm seeking even happiness. But you can say, I'm seeking an emotion that is helping me approach a decision. So you have this bucket of approach emotions, which is not a term I came up with. It's commonly used in neuroscience. And so when we use tools like facial decoding or others, we look for emotions that fit that bucket. Anticipation, joy, excitement, laughter, etc. And then, of course, as you would suspect, there's a bunch of emotions that have the goal of either avoiding engagement or decisions or withdrawing. So we're talking sadness. Anger is tricky because anger can be a force of approach. Certainly, we've seen that, and we continue.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also a force of escape, right? So you can think of, frustrations and so on. And so all my research and in all my book, I say emotions have to be considered a language of decision, of early decisions in the brain. Therefore, we need to measure them. We need to use emotional models to decide once and for all what emotions we want. Like, people who make movies, they're not going to say, whatever. They want to make us scared. They want to make us hope, with plate full of hope and so on. Well, in advertising, it's the same. And finally, visual. Now, visual is fascinating in so many levels, and it became very obvious to me that we suck at describing our visual experiences. I mean, think about the last time you went to see a museum with someone you love. It's like, wow. It's like, wow. It's like we don't have the language and probably never will. But what we know is, one, the importance of the visual system in our brain. And Cody, and remember that the occipital lobe is basically 30% of the mass of our entire brain. We have, as you would suspect, primal cortical layers, the early layers, the V1, V2, V3, are early form of processing where we recognize what is our priority. For instance, faces. Nothing is more important than recognizing faces. We do have even extra areas in the brain, like the fusiform area, that is coded simply to recognize facial expressions. So recognizing faces, that you're looking at a face, not an object. Recognizing the expressions that go with the face. That fusiform areas, by the way, is one that autistic kids don't have functioning as well, and that's at least the materialistic view of understanding autism. So I became fascinated by these functions, and it became really easy with tools like eye tracking, with tools that measure specifically the distribution of our gaze, basically fixation of our eyes on specific areas. But as eye tracking, as popular as it is, and it's been used for probably 40 years now, it doesn't give you the emotional direction. So what became obvious for neuromarketing, to me at least, is that we could bring back all these tools that were used by UX designers primarily, but start adding the layers of cognitive understanding and emotions. So by the time you have all those 6, you have a message that is packed, engineered, ready to go, and produce phenomenal impact on the primal brain specifically, but it doesn't stop at the primal brain. The primal brain is a little bit like the floodgate keeper and says finally, and remember it's at the bottom of the brain, right? So our energy, our blood has to fight basically gravity to go all the way to our frontal lobe. And the primal brain goes, okay, you know what, dude, it's worth it. Go for it. And then it starts, and so on. So the quadrant idea was to remind marketers that it's not just about the primal brain only. It's about what I call the bottom-up effect. It's about igniting in a responsible way. Sure, it can be manipulative, but igniting in a responsible way energy in the primal brain that ultimately moves upstairs into the frontal.
So that moving upstairs is something I'm curious about, because we have a rational understanding now of these 6 primal stimuli, if you will.
Yep.
Does that change how they can affect you? Because I was going through your book and I saw this little ad example of this shark about to eat this chick, and all of a sudden it's a life insurance advertisement, and I literally just learned, I was reading through all these things, and then it became personal. It was contrasted. It was tangible. She was about to get freaking eaten. It was memorable because I'm like, what the fuck is happening on the front of this freaking advertisement? It was visual. I was scared, so it was emotional. And I'm like, hell yeah, I need some life insurance. And I knew rationally what it was doing to me.
Yeah.
But still it affected me. So is there a way to defend ourselves, or is that possible? Or like, what does a consumer do when these things are being used against them?
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, there's a way to protect yourself, and you just said it, consciousness, or what I call meta-consciousness, which is the ability to know you actually can observe and be conscious. So the problem is it takes energy. And sadly, at the speed at which we consume media today and ads, very few people have the will or the energy to do so. And that's why I moved into mental health pretty big, because I wanted to share the way we respond to these situations in our brain are really calling us for pause, are really calling us to be mindful and to deconstruct very quickly. The ultimate goal of some of those ads is indeed to manipulate, is indeed to shortcut your thinking.
Yeah. Perfect segue into some of what you're doing now. Like, I would love to talk about some of the newer things you're doing based on all your research, and like what's on the horizon for you, and talk to us about open and this framework in your future work.
Thank you. And so just to close on neuromarketing, my interest now and my focus is on this merge of neuromarketing and AI. And Johns Hopkins asked me to create a graduate course, which is now available in May, 14-week course on neuromarketing AI. And so we're talking more specifically at what's going on with the processing of the data coming from neuromarketing studies and the ultimate vision of these loops that are going to happen and already are, and how we need to understand them, use them responsibly, and call for more caution, ethics, and education on it. I mentioned COVID when I received the early sign of COVID. I was actually doing a talk in a visitors group in Fort Lauderdale in February of 2020, and started to notice that my audience was not paying very much attention. I don't like that. I don't like not to be able to grab attention, and usually I can. So I called people. I called one person in particular who was, in fact, looking at his text. It's almost like you see in movies where people receive text at the same time, and they're looking at their phone and so on. I had that experience, by the way, with the missile alert in Honolulu. You remember that event? I lived in Honolulu at the time, and I was playing tennis. And everybody around me was just looking at their phone, except I still had a California number, and looked at my phone. There was nothing. Only the people with the area code 808 were saying, "Go home, there is a missile coming." And so God. I had that same experience in 2020. I'm like, what's going on now? Is it another missile? And I called up this guy. I said, "What's going on, John? You seem a little bit nervous." So I just talked to my daughter in Argentina. They decided to close the border because of COVID. And I'm like, oh no. And I was about to take a flight with my wife to go to Brazil because we've been to Brazil doing all kinds of work on our brain for some time. And we canceled everything and went back home in Honolulu. At that point, within just a few weeks, $500,000 worth of bookings all over the world were canceled. And I looked myself in a mirror thinking, I'm not flying this week. This is not possible. I fly every week somewhere. And so my life really collapsed. I experienced collapse. And it was more than I could handle. For at least a good year, I was basically a bit of a zombie until I realized that this was an invitation. Any one of those, traumas to some extent, hide an invitation, as my wife said, an initiation. And I realized this was a beautiful gift. Once I could, put the pause on some of those, mortgage payments and this and that, I was given the gift of time. And I was given the gift of maybe opening more to possibilities of digging and confronting some aspects of my busy, ego-driven life, which were excessive stress, abuse of drinking, enormous anxiety, in denial of it all. I can do it, I can muster it. And so I felt that this was my invitation to write a book. And in my work with psychedelic assisted therapy, and specifically ayahuasca, I've been working with the plant for almost 15 years. I really accelerated my understanding of self-love. And I realized this was my first opportunity to realize that I was not practicing self-love. And through ayahuasca session, I was in fact given my first book as a download. I know you're hearing a scientist tell you about an experience that most people consider woo-woo or not credible, except that since then, the psychedelic renaissance is in full blown, and we are now beginning to understand the value, not for everybody, of entering into these non-ordinary state of consciousness. So I first put my effort into writing a book called The Serenity Code, and I started to unpack principles of how we can look at specific disorders or maladaptive disorders such as high stress, high anxiety, and depression. And in that book, Serenity Code, I re-unpack the nature of our brain and the division of labor, and further confirm that all these responses, these maladaptive responses, actually start in the primal brain. You put the finger on the contribution of the amygdala, of basically the entire autonomic nervous system, which has the job of flooding our nervous system with the right chemicals, cortisol or epinephrine and so on. So I became more fluent, if you will, in the neurobiology of these conditions, and this book started my pivot to a real love of understanding primarily consciousness. What is it? What can we do with it? I looked at it as something that I could finally expend, not just something you get, at birth and that's it. So my understanding of all these new concepts, especially neuroplasticity, also started to change my view on our ability to self-heal. I was under the model for such a long time, particularly as someone with, trying to help my son, that the model was, I need to find the right doctor. I need to find the right psychiatrist. And I went from one to the other and got not just disillusioned, I got totally disappointed and realized that nobody really was interested in teaching me anything. It was just, hey, try this, give in, this dose and call me back and maybe we'll change the dose. It was an absolute ridiculous process. I found myself in the depression of the COVID doing the same thing, chasing the right medication until I realized that I was numbing myself. On top of alcohol, on top of heavy cannabis doses, which made me sleep like a dead person. My wife would shake me and say, are you alive? So I realized this is not the way I want to heal. And there's got to be other ways. And of course, neuroplasticity became the answer in one of those ayahuasca sessions. She said to me, just go ahead and become more aware of the fact that you are given, whether it's from the divine or others, the gift of neuroplasticity, which means the capacity to rewire anything. to rewire the stories that have troubled you in your past, and the stories you tell yourself about what you can do, not do, what's going to happen to your sons and your relationships and so on. So my fascination grew until we decided to go a month in Peru and do what's called the shamanic initiation. It's a very intense program with 10 ayahuasca session in 3 weeks. And more importantly, it was the first time in my life at 60 to take an entire month off, to shut down social media, to shut down all my activity, all my travel, all my intellectual, interaction with internet and so on, and a month of deep immersion into myself, into my psyche. And out of the experience, first of all, and the book has a big section on all my journeys. So I documented all my journeys. And more importantly, then I go from my journeys into a model of understanding of what self-healing is. Whether you use, plant medicine or not, it's not the point, because I talk about all kinds of modalities that are known to raise consciousness and that are known to open neuroplasticity and ultimately give you those teachings that you need to take care of your capacity to nurture your brain, to self-love your brain. So the book is really an invitation to travel with me in my personal journey. It's a by far the most personal book I've ever written. It was a catharsis in its own right, when you kind of write down. And I furiously wrote almost 80% of the book while I was in Peru. I just couldn't stop. It was just, the effect of the plant, the environment, the fact that I would get up at 2 a.m. and write 6 hours in the night furiously before I would join everybody else. When I came back, I realized, my gosh, I have all this thing. I need my citations. So I went back to my, scientific mode and started to really unpack all these core concepts. Consciousness, I get into, of course, consciousness is the hard problem, so we have a lot of homework to do, but now is an incredibly fascinating and exciting time to start poking at it from all kinds of angles. I was a materialistic scientist for most of my career, meaning denying the existence of anything that couldn't be explained scientifically, including spiritual emergence and spiritual states, or even the existence of a divine. I grew up an atheist. Most people in France grew up secular. It's a very secular environment. You couldn't talk religion with me. I would just either cringe or walk away. And so why not create a book called Open and give myself a mantra that I cannot do this anymore. I cannot dismiss, the existence of these phenomena called manifestation or karmic effects and so on. So I packed in this book what is now referred to as non-materialistic views, meaning embracing both neuroscience, in my case, because it's my thing, into neurospiritual traditions, which have existed for sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. So I unpacked, of course, all the work that's being done now today on psychedelic substances, but it's not enough. It's not because we can now decode, how serotonin is being produced and metabolized faster under ayahuasca or MDMA. It's those traditions have existed for thousands of years. So I didn't want to really do the shortcut that I think a lot of that psychedelic renaissance does, which is to suggest it's all in the substance. Of course it's not. The substance is just a name. It's just a booster of it's just a portal that ultimately invites you to come into an experience that you need a framework to understand. So the claim of Open, if you will, the goal of Open is to share that, what I call neuro-spiritual model of consciousness, in which you can find yourself, you can situate in which layers you are. Are you still in primal consciousness? And if you are, you're not going to know what's going on and why it's going on. Move into cognitive, rational consciousness, that's great, but the rational brain is highly limited in its ability to embrace information, particularly that is unstructured. So you need to move to what I call the spiritual level of consciousness, and that takes different tools and methods and rituals, but in those rituals I have found peace. I have found that I can live without anxiety, and I do. I have found that I can control stress, and I do. I have found that I can stop drinking, and I have. And so life has just bloomed for me, but so has it to all the people we work with in our retreat center.
That's amazing. I wish we had more time to dive further in. We'll have to have you back on and dive into this.
Do a second episode because I have so many questions.
Well, yeah, we got two Chloe's visit with Mama Yaya too, so y'all could talk about your journeys together some more as well. So I would love to be able to bring you back on and talk more about this. And I have a mentor who had a emotional, rational wisdom and spiritual level of consciousness that he used. IFS talks about how self-energy is in all of us, and these things like bring self-energy out and allow you to like go into that. Like, so I feel like there is an entire another episode.
Yeah, and let's be clear, I don't have the vanity to suggest that this is new. What may be new, at least I hope, is I describe myself as a polymath. I suspect you know what it means, right? So my interests, as you can see, are not just about marketing, and I have a big fascination for now spiritual traditions, quantum mechanics. I bring the teachings of quantum mechanics into our understanding of consciousness into the book. I look at AI, of course. I am a professor at Johns Hopkins for AI, prompt engineering, the language of AI. And so I contribute and dialogue with AI a lot. My wife and I have special sessions with AI where we are in conversations with AI through questioning. What's left for human is fascinating. It's learning to ask questions. And yes, we have to let go of our attachment to know or to knowledge. And the truth is, it takes a lot of space and a lot of energy in our brain. Why not use this to manipulate concepts and ask questions? And it's exactly what AI can do. It can be really your consciousness partner. It's limited, but it's extremely knowledgeable, at least depth of knowledge. And I can cross what tradition like Buddhisms have done in the approach of neurospirituality, the extent to which some of the principles of Buddhisms correlate to my principles in open. I mean, I can do this and get the answer in seconds. As a traditional researcher, a writer, I would use month and month of research to do that.
Right. Yeah.
That's why there's an explosion of new frameworks, of new approach. For instance, idealism is coming back. Philosophers are coming back, for crying out loud. The scientific conversation is no longer just about science. It's about how science interface or interact with spirituality, with philosophy. I mean, the podcasts that, like you, are willing to do that, to cut those silos of knowledge is just fascinating.
Yeah. And we absolutely are. I would love to dive in. Where can people learn more about you, like more about all of these things? Obviously your books, which we'll put in the description, but anywhere else that you'd like to point people?
Yes. First of all, our retreat center is an amazing space, a temenos, as Jung would say. It's kind of a sacred space in which you feel you can do the work that I'm talking about. The truth is, none of this is easy, which is why a lot of people avoid it. Distraction is one of the easiest way to avoid these tough conversations with yourself. So we created a space. It took us 4 years. We poured everything. I poured my pension into it. And in 4 years, we have this beautiful land on 4 acres of jungle space with 9 apartments. So we create retreats. And you can learn that about this work on mentasoul.com. So Menta, MANTASOUL.com. And from mentasoul.com, you can jump into the work that my wife and I are doing in what she has long promoted, which is called soul-centered psychology. So soul-centered psychology is very inspired by the work of Carl Jung. She has a PhD in depth psychology, and the work of other really magnificent scientists like Stan Grof. If you're familiar with breath work, because you talk about it, Cody, in your background, Stan was this, and still is alive at 92 or 93, was the grandfather of psychedelic research. He was the last doctor, the last psychiatrist allowed legally in the United States to study on patients the effect of LSD. And when this work was sadly shut down, because the fear was, oh my gosh, everybody's becoming conscious. It's going to be really hard to control people if they are, right? I'm just hardly joking. Let's shut it down. Unfortunately, we failed to uncode, to really reveal the mechanisms in the brain that could explain psychosis, dementia, and other problems that people may have, hallucinations and so on. So there's really a huge interest in both of us in bringing this science and making it digestible into modalities, whether it's meditation, breath work. So you'll learn a lot about our teachings. We do free webinars now. We just recorded a big course on the Enneagram. Are you familiar with the Enneagram?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Which is a fabulous model of personality to really do this early work of understanding your self-limited beliefs, understanding your coping mechanisms. I'm a personality neuroscientist as well. What does it mean? I'm very interested in traits. And so I've really done a lot of work. It's presented in Open. And the next book that I published called Open Up, which is basically how do you really use the Enneagram to deepen your understanding of those coping mechanisms and those narratives, those personal stories that you could finally rewrite, especially if you want to do it fast. Not just in talk therapy. I'm not a big fan. I recognize its value, but not everybody has that time or that money to do it. And so I believe that accelerators like Aya and others are designed to do that, to just really propel us into a space where we finally get it. And for some people, it does come through a bit of a shock. It was for me. I said to my wife the first time I did it, never again. And I'm, 70 sessions into it.
Wow.
Jesus. Cool.
Incredible.
All right, awesome. Well, we'll link your website, your social media, your books and everything down below, the retreat center.
Awesome.
And we really appreciate you hopping on with us today. This has been mind-blowing,
Thank you so
and
much.
for sure got to have you on again to go deeper into the other side.
I'm happy. Invite Paul and I. We could be a good pair to be together.
That's such a good idea. We should
Let's do it. Yes.
Yes. Perfect.
Because
We're
we
going
don't
to do
always
that.
agree, as you would suspect.
Even better. I love that. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for hopping on.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you
Thank
both.
you. So grateful
Really
for your
appreciate
time.
it.
Thank you.